Hello, I'm Jim Cornwall, and this is the WalkingPost.com podcast. WalkingPost.com is the news website dedicated to walking, with all the latest on gear, books, events, fitness, health, festivals, trails, and more. This podcast is number 36, and it's going out on November the 21st, almost Black Friday, which in the UK generally means buy one get one for the same price. A chilly week here, and there is snow on the tops of the mountains on Arran, which is an island not that far away from where I live. I'll probably still not be walking this weekend, although I could, because I feel like the ribs are healing at least a little bit. And thanks to all of you who asked how it was going and who sympathised, and to those who shared their own injured rib stories. It was nice to empathise, but I did cringe once or twice. Because of that, I don't really have a lot to say about my week, which might be a relief. So let's just get to November the 21st. It's World Hello Day. So, hello. It's World Television Day. Crazy to think that pretty much everyone alive today would have grown up with one in the house. Although not everybody, I do appreciate. It's Red Mitten Day, and I admit I don't have any. Actually, I don't even have any mittens, regardless of colour. It also struck me that while I was looking for things that happened on November the 21st, most of them are pretty awful. War, killings, natural disasters. No one ever mentions anything nice. Anyway, for birthdays, let's go with Goldie Hawn and Icelandic singer Björk. On last week's podcast, we had a conversation about a book being published in January, and that book was A Journey of Elevation, Lessons for Business Transformation from Everest Base Camp. This week, the conversation is about another book due out in January through Bradt Guides, one of the slow travel series about the Isle of Man, and it's written by Emma Craig. But before we get going, if that didn't count as starting the podcast, if you do have news, guest ideas, or even subjects to cover, or comments, or you want to advertise, please do get in touch via walkingpost.com, or you can just email me at jim@walkingpost.com. And I should mention at this point that you don't have to pay to be a guest or be interviewed on the podcast. I know that's the model on some podcasts, but definitely not on this one. Okay, so let's go through some of the headlines of the news you may have missed that we had on walkingpost.com this past week. Natural England has set out its vision for nature and growth. Colorado Springs in Colorado is helping tourists and hikers with a new AI chat. I hope it's better than the one I use. And 10 kilometres of new off-road active travel paths have been created in South Lanarkshire. A $5 million donation has been made for Appalachian Trail landscape protection. There's a new Hong Kong Trail hiking challenge, which looks like a lot of fun, and a coast-to-coast path upgrade has been completed. A free after-dark walking and running club has been launched in Shrewsbury, which is a great idea. RAB is reinventing its microlight for autumn and winter 2026. And there is going to be an environmental assessment of Utah's 700-mile high desert trail. That would be really awesome to do. It pretty much runs from the state line with Idaho to where Utah meets Nevada and Arizona. Some amazing scenery in Utah and very diverse too. And so you can read all of these and more at walkingpost.com. You can also listen to the podcast there if you want to, and the previous 35 as well. Right, let's get to this week's conversation. When we head down to the southernmost point of Scotland, if it's a clear day, you can look out to Northern Ireland and you can clearly see the Lake District in England. Obviously you can see Scotland, and sometimes you can see the Isle of Man. Also, because we do live relatively close to the A77, which is where vehicles coming from Northern Ireland head into Scotland, we do see the occasional Isle of Man licence plates. But it's a place that not many people know a great deal about. Maybe they know the TT races for motorcycles, and maybe they know the flag or the emblem with three legs. Other than that, not much. To put all of that right, Emma Craig has written a book as part of the Bradt Guides Slow Travel series, and it's called, as you might expect, Isle of Man. Now, this isn't one of those books where someone has been there a few times and so they're writing a book about it, because, as you will find out, Emma has a very long Manx history. Maybe to start, if you could tell me a little bit about growing up on the Isle of Man.
Yeah, sure. I was born here. Both my parents are Manx as well. I had an English grandmother, but that's the only bit of English that's in me. The rest of me is completely Manx. So I am extremely local, which actually it made it absolutely lovely growing up here because it meant we were always driving past like buildings and my dad would be like, "Oh, that was your great 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 grandfather's cottage," or kind of this place is supposed to be haunted by your great 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 uncle or something. And it's made me feel very rooted to place, I think, which was really lovely. And I think growing up here, it's very Enid Blyton-esque. There's a huge amount of freedom. Summers were always spent at the beach. We were always out, kind of out in the countryside, cycling, walking. Every Sunday afternoon, there was a mandatory walk, come rain, snow, or shine. We were always outside. And yeah, I think it was quite idyllic, really. I mean, it never really occurred to me just how wholesome me and my friends were growing up, especially as teenagers. We'd be out on the steam train in the summer, or we'd be out doing walks in the glens and things like that. And I don't think it really occurred to me quite how wholesome we were until I went to university and kind of met other teenagers who'd grown up in cities and had a completely different life growing up.
Do you ever find yourself doing that thing that, and I've been guilty of this in every place I've ever lived, but doing the thing where you navigate or tell people directions based on either things that only locals would know or things that no longer exist?
Possibly. I mean, certainly, I think Manx place names are all quite funny sounding to English ears. Ballawilly Killia is the famous one that everyone wheels out because it just sounds quite funny to English ears. It's the Gaelic roots is what we have is a lot of place names on the island. So I think that's where it comes in is you kind of say, oh yeah, you just go up to like Ballacosnahan and then turn left and go down to Ballakilferrick and whatever. And I think that's where you start drawing blanks. It's sort of when the very odd sounding Gaelic names come through.
Is there a mix of names? Is it kind of a mix of cultures?
Yeah, English is the main spoken language now and has been for a long time, but Manx is still one of the national languages and it's Manx Gaelic, so it's connected to Irish Gaelic and Scots Gaelic. So a lot of the place names do have that Gaelic root, but there's also a lot of Norse in there as well because we've got the huge Viking influence. We were Viking until the 13th century. So there is a lot of place names that have the Norse influence in them, like Snaefell, which is our only mountain. Snaefell obviously being Snow Mountain for obvious reasons when it gets cold. You can see it's the only hill that has like a little covering of snow on it. But yeah, there is that lovely kind of you can really see it in the etymology of the place names, the mixture of Scandinavian and Celtic roots, which comes through in all the culture. It really flavours the whole culture of the island, but it's absolutely there in the place names, definitely.
You were mentioning how you left the Isle of Man and came back again. What kind of perspective did that give you as to the fact that you're from there, and do you see it with new eyes?
I suppose I do. I mean, I did the classic thing of when you grow up somewhere small and possibly a bit remote. I think everyone does that classic thing going, oh, I can't wait to leave. I can't wait to get out. I'm going to go to the big city. I'm going to go and do my thing. And I'm going to, drink cocktails and wear high heels and be super glamorous and all that. And then once I kind of got there and was living an approximation of that life, I think it really brought home to me how much we have here, the richness of life here, and just the lifestyle, the fact that the air is so clean. I can walk out of my house and be in the hills in 15 minutes. I can go down to the beach. I can go cold water swimming first thing in the morning and then be back at my desk in time for work. So I think that living away, I suddenly saw what I hadn't been able to see growing up, I think, definitely. And certainly what really struck me was life over here, or certainly life growing up in my experience, was all about stories. The Isle of Man is absolutely drenched in folklore and stories and ghost stories and songs and traditions and beliefs or kind of cultural, folk beliefs that I just sort of assumed existed for everyone wherever they lived. And then I went off to university and sort of discovered that people don't have that necessarily. People who grow up elsewhere don't necessarily have that. So I remember listening to a podcast It was an interview with a lady from the Hebrides a while ago. I think it was the Folk on Foot podcast, and it was one of the singers on there. And she said she'd moved from the Hebrides. She'd grown up in the Hebrides, and then she'd moved to the Highlands at some point as an adult. And in doing so, she realised she'd gone from seeing a landscape that was essentially four-dimensional to suddenly just existing in the here and now in a way she never had done. Because when she looked at her island in the Hebrides, she could see the songs and the stories and, everything that was attached to the landscape that she was looking at. And I totally understood what she meant, because I feel like that's about the Isle of Man. I know, I can look at a castle and I know it's the home of the Maudie Doo, which is kind of the ghostly black dog, or I can drive down a particular road and know it's associated with the sort of the talking mongoose poltergeist story. And, I know that where to say hello to the fairies and things like that. So I think living away really brought that home to me, what we have in terms of cultural richness here, because I really felt I missed it. I missed it immensely when I was living in England.
Is it still there? I mean,
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's absolutely here. It's threaded through everyday life, and I think actually at the moment, in the past few years, it's really undergone a bit of a revival, partly because people like me have gone away, and then we've all come back and gone, no, we need to hang on to this because this is really important, and this is really crucial to who we are. So yeah, I mean, there are events. There's always events going on. There's events throughout the year. I mean, the big one we've just had is Hop Tuné, which is the Manx version of Halloween. Sort of, it's said to be the Celtic New Year, so I think it's got quite similar linguistic connections to Hogmanay. But it's a very Manx thing to do, is to kind of celebrate Hop Tuné, and it's sort of seen as this thing apart from Halloween. And I think it's keeping things like that going that are really lovely to do. And everyone says hello to the fairies at the Fairy Bridge. They have an announcement on the bus. There's a place southwest of the island called the Fairy Bridge, which is on a main road. And when you go over it, you do have to say hello to the fairies, otherwise they will bring bad luck, especially travel related bad luck. And it's on the way to the airport, so it's just one of those things you don't want to risk. But even on the bus, there's an announcement comes over the bus system saying, please observe the Manx tradition and say hello to the fairies. So I think that's something that's really lovely, is that it is kept alive. We do all keep it going, which I think it really gives the island a flavour that's entirely its own.
There seems to be a lot of that lately, of celebrating the roots. There are albums coming out by artists in Cornwall singing in the local Celtic language. And do you think that that's a part of it, that people are more connected?
There is absolutely an upswell in this at the moment, where kind of there is a lot more, like the folk music scene is really big at the moment, and I know trad music is absolutely huge at the moment, and there are more people looking to learn Manx, and it is a huge thing. I do genuinely wonder if it's a backlash to the times we're living in. We were just talking before about AI and the kind of the arrival of technology and the kind of the speed that technology is changing. And I do genuinely wonder if there is a human urge to hang on to what's real, in inverted commas, and what feels nostalgic and what feels comforting in a world that's just changing so fast in a way a lot of us just don't really understand or really follow. So yeah, I do wonder if it's all tied in the way that Romanticism was in the 19th century, I suppose, when the Industrial Revolution was kicking off and there was that sudden rush to the countryside and rush to poetry. I wonder if we're doing something similar.
Is there a conscious effort to hold on to those Manx traditions and everything Manx? I mean, that you do have influences, I guess, from Scotland, Ireland and England because of the proximity. Is there an identity that's influenced by those but separate?
I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we do see ourselves as a distinct culture. Absolutely. And I think the island does have its own unique identity in that sense. And there is a huge effort, from the government down, there is huge effort made to preserve that and to protect it. Culture Vannin is the cultural body of the island, and they do a fantastic job in promoting Manx culture. And next year, for example, the whole of 2026 is Year of the Manx Language. So there's going to be huge amounts of workshops, classes, teaching, events, that's going to be going on all year. And that sort of thing absolutely comes from the very top of government.
Do you find it's difficult to, when you went away to university, is there a good understanding of the Isle of Man? I think most people would know where it is, but how do you...
Yeah, no, I would say no. I definitely would say no. I think I've had so many conversations now, and I'm sure a lot of Manx people are like this, where you mention you're from the Isle of Man, and then 10 minutes later, someone says, so how do you get to the Isle of Wight? There's a bit of a disconnect. And I think there is perhaps a lack of understanding that we really are separate from the United Kingdom. We are not just an extension of England. We are quite a distinct thing. And but also I feel like who can blame people? There's not a huge amount of us. There's only 80,000 of us here. I can understand why people perhaps don't know as much about it as they could do. But it'd be lovely if more people did.
It's one of those things, though. Is it something that it's kind of like your little secret and you don't want everybody to visit, or do you want
Well,
people to
actually,
visit?
I'm sort of saying that, and I'll tell you what, the one community that knows absolutely everything about the Isle of Man and everything there is to know is the biking community. Because of the TT races we have every year in June, which is, the big, for people who don't know, it's the big road race that happens in June every year. It's the sort of biggest motorbike race in the world. And we get, I think it's about 40,000 people come over for that every year. So the biking fraternity absolutely know about the Isle of Man and know what's what and know where the best pub is and, everything like that. So I don't think it's gatekeeping so much because I think we want people to come. We want people to see that it's amazing. I think any Manx person will tell you they love nothing more than telling people about the Isle of Man. I've got colleagues I've worked with for a decade in London who know more about the Isle of Man than, they probably ever wanted to because I will never miss an opportunity to discuss it. I don't think it's gatekeeping so much. I think it's just that certainly up until the pandemic, there were decades when people in Britain in particular thought, oh, I'm going on holiday, right, I'll go to Spain, I'll go to France, I'll go to Italy. They were the holiday destinations. And I think the Isle of Man just sort of fallen off the radar. Whereas now I think maybe we're coming back round a bit and actually people are more interested in the sort of the staycation side of things or staying within the British Isles. So we're possibly now at a point where we can start really pushing the Isle of Man again and people are starting to become a bit more aware of it for that side of things.
And then there's also the coolcation thing that people just don't want to go and be in 40-degree heat when there's
Yeah,
hose pipe bands on and all those kind of
yeah,
things. So,
absolutely. Or the kind of the wildfires down in the Mediterranean and things like that. People don't want to have that. And there's no danger of it being 40 degrees here anytime soon. So we're safe on that front.
yeah, for sure. Switching to the book, how did that come about?
So that's an interesting one. It's been quite a while in the making. So I lost my dad just coming up to 4 years ago, which was all quite quick and sudden. And it's one of those things that you sort of start to suddenly see things in a completely different way, I think, when you lose a parent like that. Because yeah, we were very close, me and my dad, and we used to go out. We were always out walking or out doing things, and he absolutely loved the Isle of Man with his whole soul. And his happy place was up in the hills. Whenever he had a spare afternoon, he was off up in the hills with his camera because he used to be a newspaper photographer. He loved his camera. So he was always up in the hills. And when we'd go out and we'd go walking or we'd be out for a cycle ride, he was always telling me things about what was around us. There was always little factoids and little nuggets and, a little story connected to that little tumble down house over there, or is it meant to be a ghost that haunts this particular road, or just little nuggets and things like that. And then when he died, it suddenly occurred to me, because I've not got children of my own, so I sort of thought, I'm now the repository of all this information and all these stories and all this lovely stuff that I'm sort of now guardian of. And that's sort of where it came about, in that I wanted to start writing it down because all of this information I felt was important and needed to go somewhere and needed to be recorded. So that's how the book really started to come about. And ended up being a really great fit with the Bradt slow travel series, because that's exactly what they like to do with their slow travel series. It's not just, there's accommodation recommendations and great places to go to eat and, where to go shopping. But a lot of it is the intangible stuff, interviews with people, all the little stories and the folklore and the music attached to places and things like that. And it ended up being a really great fit. All this information that I wanted to convey and the Bradt slow travel series, they just ended up gelling really well together. So that's how it was born out of loss, really.
What are some of the highlights that maybe from your dad and from you and the connections that you have?
Oh gosh, so I think my favourite place to go, and I think the first place I would take anyone if they were visiting the island, would be down to Cregnish, which is a village right down in the southwestern tip of the island. And it's it's a hamlet really, of just like a cluster of thatched cottages, old thatched cottages, that's now an open air museum. It's part of Manx National Heritage. And it's kept as it was when it was lived in by crofters in the kind of the late 19th, early 20th century. So you can go, when you kind of got a ticket, you can go in these little cottages and you can see what life was like for these crofting families, who are families of sort of 8, 10 people living in these little 2-room thatched cottages. And I love it. I absolutely love it down there. One of the cottages is my great great grandfather's cottage, apart from anything else. So it's sort of visiting a bit of family history. But it's just absolutely highlights what was for a very long time the Manx way of living. And you go there on a glorious day and you think, God, this is just perfect. You know, I can't imagine I would want to live any other way. It's beautiful. The sun shines out on the sea. You can see the Calf of Man in the distance, which is like the little islet off the bottom of the Isle of Man. The sun shines on the sea and it's just glorious. And you think, gosh, I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. And then you go down there on a day that's not pleasant and you suddenly realize, God, this was hardship. This was absolute hardship. One bad harvest, I'd imagine, and they really, really struggled. That's one of my highlights. And I think there's another one of my absolute must-dos is going up Snaefell. The Snaefell is it's pretty much right in the middle of the island, sort of slightly to the east, but it's pretty much right in the middle. And it's our only mountain. It's just a mountain. It's 2,036 feet, I think it is. So it just tips over the threshold to be a real mountain. And you can take the tram. There's a little Victorian tramway that runs all the way around it and all the way up to the summit. And that is just a fantastic trip out. It's a brilliant day out. You get the tram down from a village called Laxey and you rattle all the way up the hill, and it's got a little piped commentary telling you what you can see and sort of a little bit of history of the area. And then you get to the top and you can just see for absolute miles. You know, you can see Scotland and England, and you can see over to Ireland. On a really, really clear day, you can see Wales. It's just like being on top of the world. And there's the most incredible cafe up there as well. It's just down towards the main road is this cafe called Victory Cafe, which is a motorbike themed cafe. It's kind of like the Ace Diner of the Isle of Man. It's on the TT course. And they do just the best pies you could ever imagine. So I think a day up Snaefell and then walking back down to the cafe to have a steak and ale pie is just, you can't beat it. Absolutely.
I assume that because of the nature of the island, there's tons of walking opportunities there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think the thing I really love about walking in the Isle of Man is that I think it's really accessible for all levels. I mean, I put my hand up. I do not have the kit. You know, I am not a serious walker with a capital W in any meaningful sense. But I can go up in the hills and I go in my trainers and jeans and take an Ordnance Survey map and just have the most fabulous day out. And I can be back down at a bus stop and back home in time for tea. So I think there's absolutely so much opportunity to get out there and to get out there in a way, you know, that doesn't involve extreme camping or anything like that, which I think makes it really accessible. And we've got options as well. I mean, I think there's a lovely walk right round the whole island, which is called the Radney Follen, which translates as the Way of the Gull. It's a long distance walking path that goes right round the whole coastline of the island. And it's just shy of 100 miles, I think. But that is a really popular one. You know, people do it in chunks. People tackle the whole thing in about 4 days, or, you know, they take years to do it sometimes. You know, they just do it in little fits and starts. But that's an absolutely lovely one. And that is one that I particularly like just for getting from place to place, you know, rather than saying, right, I'm going to go out for a dedicated walk today. What I'll do is I'll use that just as a way of getting around the coast. You know, it's a 2 or 3 hour walk from village to village, say. That makes it really accessible and really easy to weave into life. I think you can do it as well as doing other things, which I think is lovely.
If you were going to do that, is there a lot of accommodation and public transport to kind of get to hotels and stuff?
So I think the public transport certainly is absolutely there. I mean, especially, I mean, the only place where it would be slightly patchy is around the absolute top corner of the island. So the island geologically is interesting because it's sort of the top quarter of it really is completely different geologically to the bottom 3/4. So the bottom 3/4 is very hilly and very jagged and looks a lot like Cornwall, actually. It really resembles the West Country. And then the top quarter is Ice Age deposits. So it's all very, very flat and very shingly and looks a lot more like Norfolk than any of the rest of the island. But because of its geology, it doesn't have any natural harbours and therefore is very limited in terms of settlements. So there's not much in the way of villages or habitation up there. And because of that, the public transport is a lot weaker up there than it is elsewhere. So that's the only place I would say is difficult or more difficult to get around and to get to via public transport. But if you go down the kind of the east, round the south and up the west, you are never realistically that far from a bus, which is fantastic. And of course, you've got so the main towns on the Isle of Man, they're separated by the compass points. So you've got Douglas in the east, which is the capital. You've got Ramsey, which is the main town up in the north. Castletown is the main town in the south. And then Peel is the main town in the west. And all of those have options for accommodation.
Is it an expensive place?
Certainly, I remember flying from Edinburgh to Orkney and the cost of that was phenomenal. So getting over here, it's certainly not as expensive as places like that at all. You know, if you're looking for island comparisons, it's not as expensive. I was looking last night for a return trip on the boat in a couple of weeks' time. It was about £60 return for a foot passenger from England. And I know from London you can fly for sort of £50-ish from Gatwick one way. So it's not absolutely extortionate, but also, it's more expensive than like the Isle of Wight, which is just sort of 20 minutes on the ferry and 20 quid. In terms of accommodation, I think it is slightly on the pricier side, but no worse than anywhere like in the West Country or places like that. It's slightly on the pricier side purely because there is a finite amount of it. And obviously, again, it depends what time of year you come. If you come in February, you will get a bargain.
Yeah, I can imagine. How is the island balancing more tourists and wanting to attract people with sustainability and affordability for the people that are from the Isle of Man? I mean, we see here in Scotland, people buy up properties and just all they do is rent them out for Airbnb.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of an interesting conundrum, really. The short-term rentals, to rent out a property on the Isle of Man for holidays, you do have to register it. And to register it, you do have to abide by a set of regulations, and you do have to meet certain standards. So I think that does keep that does keep a lid on it to a certain extent. It's not like, I've been to places in Cornwall that are just dark in winter because all of it is just holiday homes. It's nothing like that. We don't have that issue here at all. That said, I think there is always a question of, is it really ethical to be renting out homes that could be on the general market when we are in the middle of a housing crisis? Like, there is enormous housing pressure on the Isle of Man, as much as there is anywhere else in Britain. And I think there is always going to be that tension. And I think the way to get around that, I think if people are keen to not stay in a property that could otherwise be on the general market for someone to live in, is to make use of the self-catering properties that are attached to farms and sort of local charities and things like that, because there are opportunities. Farms have turned outbuildings into lovely self-catering accommodation that couldn't possibly be otherwise on the open market, but are great for holiday accommodation. Manx National Heritage has properties that you can stay in as well, which are gorgeous little things, but again, they wouldn't be out on the general market. So I think if you're keen to do self-catering, but do it in a way that doesn't kind of just immediately go and stay in a house that would perhaps impact the housing market, then there are ways to do it over here, which are really nice, actually, and they really give you a deeper flavour, I think, of what Manx life is like.
I suspect that the only time that people shouldn't maybe go there is during the TT races because they won't find anything.
I mean, that depends. When you say should, yeah, I mean, it depends. I mean, if you're into motorbiking, then absolutely come here during the TT races. It's fabulous. I love it. I'm not a biker myself, but I love the TT races just because the atmosphere is incredible. The racing is brilliant. The whole island becomes a completely different place for that fortnight. It's brilliant. But yeah, I mean, that there is no accommodation anywhere. You need to book it very, very far in advance. I think quite often travel companies and travel packages become available a year in advance for the TT. So they'll start advertising the next year's during that year's races. And in terms of accommodation, you can't possibly accommodate 40,000 people suddenly on an island. So what ends up happening is they end up transforming all the local football pitches into campsites, and they do a big homestay scheme where people go and camp in people's gardens and things like that. So it's absolute pandemonium, but it's brilliant pandemonium.
All right. You mentioned that the book isn't the typical travel guide that you would normally expect. Can you tell me a little bit about how the book is laid out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the basic organization of the book is geographical, which is probably very standard. So I start in the east and I go anti-clockwise round. I start in the east with Douglas and I go round to the north, west and south. I think what makes it different to the regular travel guide is I've really wanted to put local voices first and foremost in the book. So all the way through, I've got interviews with local people, like local farmers, people who are local craftspeople, local authors, things like that. I really wanted to put the experience of what it is to be Manx at the front and center of this book, because I think quite often, and I think I feel it quite strongly being an islander, is that people tend to come from outside and they will come in and they will talk about us in the third person and they'll take that away and they'll go away again, and that's what gets published. Whereas I really wanted to be able to tell the Manx story from our own perspective. So that's what I've really tried to do. I've also tried to include a huge amount in there of the intangible stuff. So yes, you've got the restaurant recommendations, you've got, a recommendation of a place to stay, you've got a recommendation of where to go for a nice walk. But also I've got the ghost stories, I've got the stories about the fairies, I've got the story of the Queenie scallops, which is our kind of local little scallop, which is much smaller than the scallops that you'd normally get, which I think are called king scallops. But things like that, it's all the little things that wouldn't necessarily be on a signpost or on an information board. I've tried to include all those as well, so people get a real holistic flavour of what the island is like.
I think that's what people seem to be looking for now, though, is that experiential tourism.
I mean, certainly, I put right at the start of the book, on the first page of the book, I've put in that the book is what I would tell any visiting friend. And that's absolutely what I've gone for. You know, if we were driving around in the car or we were out on the bus, I'd be sitting saying, oh, you know, that place over there, that's connected to this, that's connected to that particular fairy story. Or, oh, there's the ghost of a woman with a spinning wheel who's supposed to walk down this road. That's what I really wanted to convey. So it's sort of, that's the flavour I've tried to give the whole book.
Did you learn anything while you were going around talking to people?
Oh gosh, I tell you what I learned, what really, really struck me. So it's one of those things, you know, when you know something in your head, but you haven't quite grasped it in your heart. It's just how many Neolithic and Bronze Age stone sites there are on the Isle of Man. And it sounds quite niche, but I was trying to point out, making sure I pointed out all the little interesting things to go and see, all the quirky little sites that, you know, you might miss if you were just doing the headline sites to go and visit. And I found myself just endlessly writing about these Bronze Age burial sites. And it was only when I was sort of actually kind of working my way through the book and working my way around the island, I was like, they're absolutely overrun with them. Everywhere you go, there's just these amazing Neolithic stones or these kind of amazing Bronze Age mounds in the middle of housing estates or just at the side of the road or things like that. And that was what really struck me when I was writing about it, is how much of our history is still here. You know, living in London for years, obviously all that history was there once, but has just been trampled by building and development. Whereas here you can just go out and eat your sandwich sitting on a Neolithic stone. It's amazing.
And I guess then, though, you have the job of balancing the book so that it isn't just about Neolithic stones.
Yeah, oh no, absolutely. I mean, there is a book about the Neolithic stones. There's a book called Archaeological Sites of the Isle of Man, and that has absolutely every coffin spit you could possibly want. You know, every interesting pebble that you could possibly want is in that book. And I've definitely not gone down that road. My hat's off to the people who put that book together, because it is spectacular as a piece of work. But no, I've definitely tried to keep the balance of, you know, you can go and visit the stones, but also go and have a nice coffee and a piece of cake in a nice cafe somewhere as well.
You mentioned a mongoose earlier. What are some of your favorite, or maybe one of your favorite stories about the island?
Okay, so I mean, Jeff the Mongoose is a particular favorite of mine. So Jeff the Mongoose, this was a story from the 1930s, and it's to do with a farmhouse down on the kind of the southeastern coast of the Isle of Man. And it was a farmhouse that had a family living in it, and there were parents and a teenage girl called Vori. And Vori alleged that she started hearing the voice and scratchings in the house. And sort of the story developed into she was hearing the voice of a mongoose, a little poltergeist mongoose called Jeff. And Jeff gave all sorts of stories about his origins. I think he said he'd come from India, and, you know, he'd been seen up at the bus depot in Peel and things like that. And he'd given all these alleged stories about what he was and where he was from. But the reason I love this story is because it really gained traction, and it ended up in the national press. Like the London papers ended up covering it, and inspectors were sent over from England to investigate. And I mean, ultimately, I think it was pretty much established that it was a hoax and was just the invention of people who were out in the sticks in long winters and had a lot of time on their hands. But I love it because this story just upped and ran. You know, it just became a thing in itself. The fact that this story that began just as kind of a bit of local gossip somehow made it down to the newspaper offices in London. And actually, it became a film a couple of years ago. I think it was Foda and the Talking Mongoose. I think it had Simon Pegg in it. It came out just a couple of years ago. But this story is still up and running. And I just love that. I think I love it because it's the nature of storytelling itself and the power of stories to keep existing. I think that's why I really like that one.
What's the difference between a slow travel guide and a typical guidebook?
So slow travel, it really is focused on it's things that are off the beaten track. So you've got kind of the headliners and the main things to go and see, but it also takes you to things that, you know, kind of the lovely little family restaurant that you perhaps might have missed, or like these stone circles or these kind of stone monuments that you perhaps might have just driven past and not known what it was, but it gives you the information, it tells you what it is. And it also has a bit more of a focus on the sustainable and the ethical and the ecologically sound ways of travelling as well. So there's more focus on public transport and how to get there by ferry rather than plane and things like that as well. So there's more of a focus on that side of things.
All right. And what do you think the target audience is for the book?
If you really want to go and get absolutely under the skin of the island and really find out what it is, not just to visit the Isle of Man, but to be Manx, I think that's the people that this book is really for. I want it to be a good read, even if you're not on the Isle of Man. If you just want to know about the Isle of Man, know about what's here and kind of get a flavour of it, then, do a bit of armchair travel. Hopefully this book would tick that box as well.
And do you think that it's whet your appetite to write more on the Isle of Man, more books?
I'd love to. I'd love to. So as I mentioned earlier, I just moved back here like 3 weeks ago after living away for my whole adult life. I've literally just come back, and I think, oh, there's got to be something in that, hasn't there? There's got to be something in moving back to your island as an adult and kind of rediscovering it. Although I was slightly worried that Amy Liptrop might have beaten me to this with The Outrun. I think her book, her memoir from Orkney, probably is like the iconic one of that. So I might have to find a slightly different angle. But yeah, I would love to write more about the Isle of Man. I feel like there's definitely more to be said about the island.
Well, from what you're saying, there's the history, there's folklore, there's everything.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my job for next year is I want to start learning Manx, because I never learnt Manx Gaelic growing up. I missed it. I kind of just skirted around it. And to my absolute shame, it's something I really, really regret. So I would love to learn Manx. And maybe that's it. Maybe next year it's rediscovering my island through what should really be my mother tongue. It's only by accident that I speak English rather than Manx. So maybe that's it. Maybe that's the route I should go.
Well, after that, I must do an interview with someone in a place that I've either been to lots of times or don't really want to go, because every time I talk to someone on the podcast, I want to go there. And I would love to do that 100-mile circuit of the island, although I'm not sure I could pronounce it. Maybe with practice. There are lots of islands I'd love to visit, including some in Scotland that are close and still haven't been to. So we'll leave it there for this week. If you do have news or suggestions for podcast guests, please do get in touch through jim@walkingpost.com, as I'm always looking for guests, whether it's about a new trail, new equipment, a new book, or somebody who's just done an amazing walk somewhere. But if you have done an amazing walk, let's save the Isle of Man for a bit, seeing as that was this week's subject. So I hope you enjoyed this week's WalkingPost.com podcast, and I hope you have a great week, hopefully with a walk somewhere, whether it's the Isle of Man or Isla Mujeres in Mexico, which means Isle of Women. I just thought I'd try and be clever with Island of Man and Women. I know that the Isle of Man isn't named after man, before all the emails come in. So, until next time, happy trails! Walking Post from walkingpost.com is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.